Welcome to a Wonder Junkie podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Anderson.
Nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows. Nobody has the faintest idea. The best guesses are lies. You may be sure of it.
All right, Mark, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, brother. I was tuned into you in 2021 with a mutual friend, Kyle Kingsbury. He told me to read your book, The End of Upside Down Liberty. And that was fascinating. That was my first introduction to anything you had said or spoken or written. And so I went diving a little bit deeper. I've listened to a bunch of your podcasts. I think The Way Forward was a really unique one. And you've got some fascinating perspectives. And a lot of things that you say are counterintuitive, which is a lot of how things end up in life. But I'd love to dive into a lot of your book that is The End of Upside Down Thinking, because that's the one I think I have the most curiosity about. But we can go into each one of your books, because I think you've written, 8 now?
7.
7. Okay, that's a lot of writing in a short period of time. But I'd love to just get into some of the principles of each one throughout the conversation, so people that have never heard your work can gain a little bit of an understanding of how you're thinking and what your goal is for others. Because it takes a lot of effort to put all of your energy into writing these books. And I think that the mission behind it is to get people curious and to get people a little bit more healthily skeptical, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. Well, if I were to zoom out even farther than just the mission for what other people will think or how they'll interpret the books, a big part of the mission is my own growth, is that I learn about something that shifts my own perspective, and writing the book helps me crystallize it. But also what happens is that there's this inner passion to share it with other people. So I have an internal shift that I think is very powerful because I experience it myself. And then I have a desire to share it with other people. That's basically what I'm doing. And then the tactics I use are, I want to do it in the most digestible manner possible. My books have hundreds of citations. Typically, they're research-based. So I want to give people the backup, or if they want more detail, they can go to the footnotes, go to the bibliography. And I also try to make the books not too long. And I like to make them move from one topic to the next, where you don't get lost too much in one thing, so that people can take in a lot of information on a certain topic in a relatively short amount of time, because I know people are busy. And I know what my process is like in each of these paradigm shifts. It takes a lot of time and effort, where I'm going all in, spending all day basically learning about this stuff. And I want to make the process more efficient for people. And that's what these books are.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I would love to get into a little bit, just for the audience, some of what those initial paradigm shifts were internally for you. I think you, like me, were getting into float tanks, and in the initial points in my life, I think 2009 or 2010 is when I discovered floating. And that was when my whole world was being flipped upside down, because I had never really slowed down enough to give myself permission to even be curious about the nature of consciousness to that degree. So it was really uncomfortable, because I was butting up against a lot of the internal dialogue and all of my conditioning and programs, and then having these incredible experiences that I had no language for, which we'll get into in this podcast. But I'm curious a little bit of your trajectory and how you got started thinking differently and getting so obsessed or blown away by this field.
Yeah, I would say both obsessed and blown away. Those are good terms to use. I think for your audience's benefit, if they're not familiar with my background, that's important, because I didn't come out of the womb asking these questions. It took 30 years of living before I went into these rabbit holes. And when I hit 30, this was in 2016, I, in hindsight, realized I was going through a dark night of the soul, where there were things in my personal and professional lives that weren't going the way that I wanted, even though on the surface it looked like I was doing very well. Like, I went to Princeton undergrad, was one of the captains of the tennis team, went into investment banking in New York during the financial crisis of 2008 to 2010. And then I worked in Silicon Valley, became a partner at a firm advising technology-focused companies on their innovation and intellectual property strategies. So that's where I was, 2016, having this somewhat of a life crisis, not really sure where my life was heading, feeling like I was on a treadmill where I was constantly sprinting toward the next achievement, But having achieved many things in the past, I realized I was not getting satisfaction or lasting peace or happiness from that. So I felt like a zombie. And I started listening to podcasts in 2016, which led me to explore things like sensory deprivation, float tanks, where I was floating in a pod of salt water, where there's so much salt in the water that the body just floats up, and I would turn all the lights off, no sound. And I was exploring alternative health, then came across research on the science of consciousness and the idea that there could be interdimensional intelligences that human beings can communicate with, and that psychic abilities are real, and that when we die, that's not the end of our consciousness, and that there might be something that connects all of us that we don't see with our eyes, and that there's even potentially a higher intelligence, God, whatever you want to call it, a unified field, moving in that direction that some would call spiritual or even religious. Even though I wasn't adhering to one religion, I was coming across these data points, whether it was individual anecdotes like near-death experience accounts, or the US government's psychic spying program, which has been validated by declassified documents, or peer-reviewed literature on these sorts of phenomena, psychic abilities, survival of bodily death, moving in this realm of there's meaning to life. It's not all just random and meaningless, which is what I believed at the time. I thought when you die, that's the end of our consciousness. There's no more awareness. So it's lights out, and we just have to live for this period that we're born in a body. And when we die, that's the end of it. And there's no meaning. Deal with it. That was my perspective until I came across this body of research, which it did not shift me overnight. So it was not as if I had a big DMT experience and then I felt the oneness and came back and was telling everyone about it, or having a near-death experience, or having something in the float tank. It was gradual. I would learn about information through books, peer-reviewed literature, podcasts. Then I would go to work and I would feel like I was back in the mundane real world. And I would go back and explore these things. And then I would go back to work and think to myself, well, this stuff can't be real. It just doesn't, I know what the world's like. It's not this mystical spiritual thing. And then I would go back and look at the literature and I'd realize, okay, I can't get around this. There's too much data here at a certain point. And then I began to work with a lot of psychics, healers, people that could do some of the things that I was reading about or had direct experience with it. And they were sometimes able to tell me things that I couldn't explain using just probability or randomness. It was like beyond chance. Or even people that could know things about me that they would have had no way of knowing. And so I had these little experiences myself, even synchronicities, occurrences that were just repeatedly happening. Carl Jung used that term synchronicity. So I was having some direct experiences that I would call largely mild, and then a lot of research. And then the body of data accumulated to a point that my intellectual mind rationally could not dismiss all of it. Maybe one incident, I could say, yeah, that was just chance. Or maybe, I don't love the methodology of this one study. Or, yeah, this is a compelling anecdote, but that's just one person. There were too many, and I couldn't dismiss all of it. And my rational mind said, okay, Mark, you can't dismiss all of this. And you have to then look at the implications of what's going on here. You have to rethink your belief system that life is random and meaningless. And maybe there's a whole dimension of reality or dimensions that a lot of modern society, including much of my network, is totally unfamiliar with. And that means much of academia is wrong about what they're teaching. And this is huge. So I went all in, not knowing I was going to write a book. The book came a year into this research. In summer of 2017, I said, I need to put this into a book. And when I say this, the first book, which is called An End to Upside Down Thinking, published in 2018, I was exploring something that unified all of these phenomena, whether it's telepathic abilities or psychic spying, known as remote viewing, sending the mind out far away in space and time, or a near-death experience when a person has little or no brain functioning and yet their consciousness is hovering over their body and they're able to see and hear things that were happening from that vantage point. And then when they're resuscitated, they come back and tell the doctor and family members. So at a time when their brain was barely functioning at all, if it was functioning at all, they were able to have non-hallucinatory memories, things that were actually verified as accurate from that vantage point. Or young children who remembered a life that was not their own and sometimes had birthmarks or physical defects aligning with the alleged death of the previous life. And researchers at the University of Virginia since the late 1960s have been compiling 2,500 plus of these cases and actually find historical and medical records validating what these young children are saying. Basically, these disparate areas that all sound paranormal. They sound like science fiction, but they're unified by a question, which is around consciousness. So I didn't start off this journey saying, I'm going to analyze consciousness. I started off coming across phenomena that challenged my worldview, and I realized the unifying idea was they all related to consciousness. And When I say consciousness, it is something that I would argue is impossible to define with words because it is something intangible. It's a part of us that is experiencing, but I can't point to it. I can't draw it out. And perhaps even by using language, we're limiting what it is. But my best way of describing it is it's the part of us that's having experience. That's what I mean by consciousness. So we all have consciousness right now. What I didn't recognize until I began researching was that science does not understand consciousness very well at all. There's even something famously known as the hard problem of consciousness. And Science magazine, about 20 years ago, put out its top 25 questions remaining in all of science. And the number 2 question on the list was, what is the biological basis of consciousness? In other words, how is it that human biology or any organism's biology is birthing this consciousness that we all have? The issue with that question, though, what is the biological basis of consciousness? It presupposes in the question that there is a biological basis of consciousness. I think the question should have been, is there a biological basis of consciousness? Or how does consciousness emerge? How does it come about? Now, why is that such a hard question? I can imagine members of your audience could think, we know from neuroscience that there's a lot of stuff happening in our brain. Very specific things happen in the brain when specific things happen to our consciousness. So we can damage or stimulate one part of the brain and then see the corresponding shift in consciousness. So a part of the brain responsible for vision, damage that, and what happens? The person's eyesight shifts. Or certain parts of the brain responsible for short-term memory, damage that, what happens to someone's memory? The memory will shift. So there are these tight correlations between brain activity and conscious experience. And many people often take the next leap, which to me is the fatal flaw potentially. They say, because the brain is so closely related to our conscious experience, it must be the case that the brain is creating our consciousness. Why is that a problem? Because it's not always the case that because two things are correlated, that one is causing the other. In the same way that if we went to the scene of a fire and we saw a bunch of firefighters there, we could naively conclude firefighters were there, they caused the fire. Obviously, firefighters were there with the fire, so of course the firefighters caused the fire. We know there are other ways to explain the causal relationship. Actually, the firefighters were putting out the fire. Someone could even say that fire has a mystical ability and the firefighters came out of thin air because the fire manifested the firefighters. So the point is, when there's a lot of data, you can make many stories out of it. And what happens with the brain and consciousness, there's a prevailing story, which is, look, brain is correlated with conscious experience, therefore brain creates consciousness. And one of the reasons I think science can get away with that leap is that we cannot see consciousness. No one has ever seen consciousness pop out of a brain because it's an intangible, abstract thing. This is the hard problem. If I were to paraphrase it, the hard problem of consciousness is our brain and our body, these are physical entities that we could point to, we could study them, we could characterize them. Consciousness is something that we experience subjectively. And it feels like our consciousness is up by our head because our eyes, our ears, mouth, nose, so much of our perceptual organs are up by our head. So it really feels like we are conscious up near our brain. So that's biasing us too. What's not considered as often, however, something I never considered until 2016, is what if the brain is actually like a receiver, like an antenna? It's picking up a signal and consciousness is like the signal. Or more precisely, what if the brain is like a filter and our brain is getting in the way of a much bigger consciousness, but it limits it as some kind of an interface. And maybe the brain could even transmit consciousness, like a telepathic or psychic communication. It would be like saying, there's an antenna on our television set, and that's allowing us to watch TV. No one would dispute that. Then we take a hammer and smash the antenna, and all of a sudden the TV show on the screen is very scratchy. We don't conclude that the antenna was producing the signal. We know that the antenna is an apparatus, a physical structure that's receiving a signal and processing it so that you can watch a television show. And when you damage that apparatus, the signal has not been damaged. The signal is still floating out there, but the thing that's receiving it has been damaged. So we could take that analogy and say, oh, well, when someone has brain damage, maybe that's why their consciousness is shifting, because it's the apparatus that's receiving consciousness or filtering it in some way. Oh, that's another way to explain it. That doesn't prove one or the other. The point is there are many ways to explain neuroscience beyond brain creates consciousness. So what I did in this first book, in End to Upside Down Thinking, is I made the argument that if there is even one case where we see something where consciousness seems to be beyond space and time, or even beyond the brain, that would seem to challenge the idea that the brain creates consciousness and that consciousness is stuck in our skull. That's known as scientific materialism or even physicalism, which is that all of reality, including consciousness, is something that comes out of physical interactions of things. And when you have little billiard balls like atoms and quarks and subquarks, especially at the level of a human organism, you're going to end up with a spontaneous process. It's known as an epiphenomenon. Consciousness will just pop out. That's the physicalist belief system. The alternative is, well, maybe it's not, consciousness is not derived from something physical, and our physical body is tapping into consciousness. My argument is, if we can find any of those cases, even one example that is not explained by the physicalist view, then that view of reality is inherently incapable of describing how reality works, and therefore it's an incomplete and incorrect theory. Whereas if we went to another view of reality where consciousness has some kind of maybe fundamental role, or maybe consciousness is beyond the body and the body's tapping in, we might be able to explain these things like psychic abilities and near-death experiences much better. And my goal in that book was not to claim that every single example is 100% accurate. My goal was, to say to the reader, basically, can you disprove every example? Because if you find one thing in here that's not explained by physicalism, then we've got a big problem, because we already have a big problem in science, which is we don't understand how consciousness could come out of a brain. How could something that's abstract and not physical just pop out of something physical? There's no explanation for that. So we're already on very shaky grounds in the mainstream thinking. We don't understand consciousness. And then we bring in these other phenomena, though that can bring us into a new paradigm, not only of consciousness, but also of what it means to be a human being. Because if the brain is tapping into consciousness, what does that mean that we are? That was the big epiphany for me of, wait a second, we are trained in the mainstream system not to understand who and what we are. What if we are a vehicle or a vessel of consciousness and our identity is way beyond the body? Whoa, I need to understand this for my own well-being, and then I want to share it with people.
Dude, I love it. And I love hearing you. You've really spent the time to articulate it and to package it and to organize it, because when you start to have the subjective experience, which is where a lot of people end up, is that they've probably never really spent the time to explore the different forms of language and theories and what people have come to find out about the nature of consciousness. They're just busy working, or they're just busy inside of a system that they've inherited. And that's always been fascinating to me, is to witness and to experience subjectively your own consciousness and to get curious about yourself, which is in relationship to the whole. It's not separate. And those are some of the first yogic principles when you start to get to reverse engineer like these subjective experiences, as you go, okay, what's happening in here? These out-of-body experiences, these profound mystical experiences, you could call them. And then you come to find out that people have been studying this stuff for thousands of years. And that was the first thing I realized, was like, thank God, because I was starting to feel alienated and weird, and I would be journaling. And, that was really helpful for me to start to discover the Carl Jungs, and then to go even deeper and see the Yoga Sutras, and then go deeper and to find out that there was ancient civilizations maybe 10,500 years ago that maybe reached these peaks of understanding things that we can't even wrap our head around because of our models being completely off. So I love what you're doing, is because you're helping people to just see first that the understanding of consciousness itself, if we can't even understand that consciousness is a giant mystery, then we can't even take the next step to understand physics and to understand the laws of nature, our place in the universe, like what it means to be human, like you said. And so we have to question authority. And I think that's a real problem right now, is that people are so trusting of a system that's been built on not lies, but just false models or broken models or limited models. And I don't even know if that was done nefariously or intentionally. That's where we can get into some of those theories. But I love where you're going here. So when you started to finally sit down and write this book, was it like a Rupert Sheldrake type thing where you're like, I need to give the principles of the first foundational things? Because I loved his book, The Science Delusion. That was one of my first aha moments of questioning everything that I had been taught in school.
What I wanted to do in that book, and at the time I was still working, so I was thinking from the perspective of, I'm working in a serious looking job, and I'm going to talk about things that will sound insane to people. How can I do this with a straight face and actually blend topics that one might call spiritual with actual science? So the book is a science book, and it won an award actually in 2019 for Best Science Book of the Year by IPPY. I give your audience that context to say this is actually a science book, even though it might sound crazy if you're new to these topics. There's actually that much research out there. And I wanted to show that to people. I wanted them to understand the breadth and depth of this research. But I also wanted to lay the foundation, like you just said, of why this is meaningful on a metaphysical level, because really we're talking about here, what is the nature of reality? That's an important topic as a container for any other subject, like medicine or cosmology or liberty, these other things I've written about. One needs to have a metaphysical container for, well, what is a human being? What is society? We need to have an understanding of reality to put these other disciplines in too. So I laid that foundation and also talked about many of the things I just discussed of what is the hard problem of consciousness? What's the basis on which anyone can agree? Any scientist or skeptic alike or believer will say there are these questions and problems in mainstream science. We can all agree that we don't understand these things. That's important to acknowledge that the mainstream has these questions. And then in the book, I introduced elements of physics. Some of those things I don't fully agree with now as I've gotten into cosmology. But there are very strange things that happen, observations that have occurred, especially in the realm of what's known as quantum. And whether those are actually quote unquote quantum phenomena or just they can be explained another way, there are things that suggest there's an interconnectivity, for example, in reality. It's known as quantum entanglement. Things like that I wanted to bring into the book because, again, that to me brings more credibility to ideas that could sound insane. So I didn't get into the psychic stuff really, or the surviving bodily death until later in the book. That was intentional. The structure was to lay those foundations first. And if someone still cared enough to read, they would hopefully have the priming to say, okay, I see the way reality is working on things that most people can agree with. Now you're going to just take me the next step further. It's less of a big leap to say, here's a declassified document from the CIA, which says, direct quote, remote viewing is a real phenomenon. Implications are revolutionary, and actually show the document. Remote viewing refers to psychic spying, sending the mind out far away in space and time and saying, I'm not there physically, but I can see it, and they get it accurately. For example, that would have sounded crazy maybe to start the book with that thing. For some people, that's too big a leap, but to actually phase it in. That was my strategy, at least, especially coming from the business world and doing a lot of that kind of work in my professional life, because I worked with intellectual property and complex technologies and had to simplify and synthesize those things so that senior management teams and boards of directors could understand the information. So I was applying a lot of what I was doing professionally to this other area. But I should add that even with that structure, I didn't and probably still don't connect with everyone. I had a friend who was nice enough to read the manuscript before it was published. I wanted to send it to a few people, and this is someone I really respect. Very smart guy in the financial world. And his reaction was, Mark, we need to sit down and talk about this. Because as your friend, I cannot let you publish a book on this subject. People are going to think you are insane. That's what he said. And I was like, dude, explain to me what's wrong with this. And one of the arguments he made was that the statistical evidence for some of the phenomena, like psychic abilities, the statistical evidence is too good that they must be fudging the numbers. And
Wow.
How could it be, basically? I don't remember if he said this specifically or if he was alluding to it. Like, who are you to just say that all these PhDs and MDs around the world, that they're all wrong? And you're saying this? Like, no, that's not possible, because there's this reverence I see, especially among those who are educated within the system, like myself, reverence for people that have the advanced degrees. And it's too hard for many people to believe that so many of them could be wrong. And it is something I address in the book too, like the dynamics of paradigm shifts and how the world goes one way and then we realize that they were wrong. So you could be a very smart person, and even without having a nefarious intent, innocently propagate a narrative that's false just because you've been taught it, or because you're too blinded to see that the assumptions you're basing things on are false, or there's too much hubris that you don't want to acknowledge your entire career as a PhD or professor was wrong. There's a lot of forces. We could get into the nefarious stuff too. I think that exists. But even putting that aside, there are a lot of social dynamics that will allow these things to propagate because people don't want to change their minds.
Yeah, I love it. And I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, but I do want to touch on it because you just brought it up. The forms of thinking that people have where it's innocent, really. It's like we're all just living in the world that we inherit and we work within those frames. One of the things I started to discover years ago, and have dove in deep enough into it to see that there's so much incredible compartmentalized social engineering systems when you talk about the CIA and MK Ultra and all that. And then you zoom out further and see where the history of that goes back to. and you even look at the history of religion and certain things, I always like to try to figure out, okay, if I'm thinking based on what my culture hands me and I want to unprogram and reprogram with new abilities to think differently and to try to approach reality to seek the truth about the nature of myself and the world, you have to first wonder who's telling the truth and what information to trust. And when we saw the pandemic, which you wrote about in one of your books, actually two of them, the Upside Down Medicine, and then what was the name of the other one?
Upside Down Liberty.
Liberty.
Get into that a bit.
Yeah, we got to get into some of that. But I'm like, what have you come to realize? Because during the COVID pandemic, I've been kicked off Twitter just for having people question reality. And in all my videos about that, Peter McCullough, Dr. Jack Cruz, Thomas Seyfried about cancer, they're all banned and shadow banned, and they get like 40 views. And so we're in an algorithmic AI narrative control system now, which is highly sophisticated, which is a big deal. Like, people seem to think, oh, who cares? Like, your social media is censored, but it's like, this is narrative control, which is mind control. Yeah. And when you start to wonder about innocence versus like, is there nefarious actors inside of this? I don't care. I want to know, is there someone orchestrating it? And if so, why? And what is the underlying motive to drive culture and thinking and science in a centralized system in a certain way? Is it for profit? Is it for, so I'm curious where you go with this when I start to bring that up.
I'll give you a quote that I reference in a few of my books from Mario Beauregard. He's a neuroscientist who focuses on the science of spiritual phenomena. He said in an interview a few years ago on a podcast called Skeptico that he was told by the head of a neurological institute in Canada, a very prominent place, a very prominent person, said to him, "As long as I'm alive, you will not be able to study spiritual phenomena." And what his comment was to that in this interview on Skeptico, he said, "This is clearly social engineering. It's dark versus light." To me, he's referring to what I've called in my books a spiritual war, that there is a desire somehow to keep humanity in a state of ignorance in many domains. What I realize now, when I wrote my first book, I thought it was just about the nature of consciousness and who and what we are at a high level, just the metaphysics. Of course, we both know that there are many other ways in which we're being misled about the truth. And that's where I land, is that at the highest level, it's probably not even physical, that there are beings that some would call demonic or whatever. I don't fully understand how it works, but that energy or those intelligences seem to be working through human beings. Sometimes those human beings consciously tap into them through a phenomenon known as satanic ritual abuse, which I've talked about in some of my books, which is really a heinous topic, but basically bringing about such torture in other humans and animals that this invokes dark beings who feed off of that dark energy. And then they do things like promise power to the people that are doing that sort of dark thing because they're giving the dark energies a food source. That might be on the most extreme level of darkness tapping into humans. But I think also it doesn't require that kind of a horrific ritual for someone to tap into darkness. They can make a conscious decision to act immorally in their lives. Or maybe they get in such a state of trauma that their antenna is basically tuned into a fear state. They're so traumatized that they end up bringing about more trauma. So there might be many mechanisms by which this spiritual war is playing out. But to me, at the core, it is ultimately about disconnecting human beings with the truth. And this question of consciousness that you started us with is at the core of it. Because if we're misled about what a human being is, if we're in the state that I used to be in, and if I was 180 degrees off, I used to think that I'm a random product of 13.8 billion years of a universe, starting with a big bang that no one has ever verified. It only exists because of a series of inferences, which we can talk about later. And after that 13.8 billion years, when particles were colliding randomly in this massive universe, I emerged in this completely random process, and then I'm going to die, and my body, once it shuts off, it's like a computer that just shuts off, and that's the end of my consciousness. And there's no entity or intelligence that cares, and there's nothing that matters fundamentally about my life beyond what I make it out to be in my own mind. That was my belief system, and that's what science is really promoting, whether they say it that way or not. That's the implication of scientific materialism and physicalism. If that's what we're being taught, and I was there myself, that is such and if it's wrong, I and others have been misled on a massive scale with regard to the nature of reality and who and what we are, at a level that could be very harmful on a spiritual level. I mean, that's what I'm trying to understand. What are the implications for, let's say, a soul? Let's say our body is the vehicle for consciousness, and we could call that individuated consciousness a soul. What are the implications from being disconnected with your true nature and ignoring the existence of the soul? Does that hold the soul back in some way? Is there something worse? Does it not matter? We need to know the answers to those questions. But I have a feeling there's a great significance to each individual soul, and that the reality of who and what we are and what this place is brings so much more significance to each individual that there would be an incentive for a dark force to want to shut that down and keep us in the dark. So that's where I have landed. I didn't start off this way in my first book and end upside down thinking. I wasn't thinking about the spiritual war. I was much more in the mode of, well, there are a lot of scientists who don't want to change their mind, and that's okay. They're just ignorant and arrogant, and eventually that's going to change, and we're going to get more funding. It'll shift. I think that exists, but there's this darker element that is pervasive throughout so many disciplines that's keeping us in the dark.
Yeah, it's fascinating. There's a lot of threads there. I've been lucky to have some cool people in my life that have spoken to this. One of them's name was Don Howard. He ended up living with me for like 6 months at the end of his life, and he spent 30 years or so exploring and helping people to have these medicine experiences. And I actually partook down there in 2018. And I just remember a lot of the questions I would have were about psychological, spiritual warfare, things like that. Yeah. And so I'm very willing and probably leaning into that with the way that I approach my own non-ordinary states, my own life, just being mindful of dark energy, light energy, believing in that stuff. But I'm also at the same time willing to just, for the average person in society and just for the sake of, I just don't know, I like to live in that and be okay with that. And having my true faith is sort of living in an I don't know state, and certain things I do for certain know. And one of them is that this whole thing is very complex and mysterious and fluid, and it's beyond our imagination. And so just looking at the track record of human beings, it seems like there's always been a war on consciousness when it comes to language, especially the way that we shape and speak and think. And I was speaking to this really brilliant guy recently at this quantum biology experience out in Tennessee. His name is Peter, and he's like this brilliant, like artistic guy that's also got a physics background, and he was doing some incredible experimentation and just breaking down a lot of the things that you've broken down in different ways. And one of the things he was talking about was ancient Greek and ancient Sanskrit and some of these ancient languages. And when you start to go deeply into them and you follow the track record, the language has been chopped up and butchered, and words are getting flipped around, and then Old English and then English. And now what we're left with is this like hijacked linguistic narrative structure to even describe the nature of reality and the nature of consciousness, which is so weird. It's like all of our models are not only completely off, but so is our ability to describe them, and even our vantage points of seeing how to describe them, you know? And so that's fascinating, is the history of language and where people have burned books and hijacked languages and burned people at the stake to now have this forward momentum. And if you want to just look at it as humans and incentives and get rid of the spiritual warfare stuff, let's get into some of what you discovered in your Upside Down Medicine book, and like the history of the Rockefellers and how they just completely hijacked how we think about our own health.
Yeah. Well, if we just apply the discussion on consciousness to medicine for a moment, medicine is allegedly treating a human being and a human body. And if we've misunderstood what a human being is, then how could we effectively treat someone with a medical system? So it is fundamental first to understand the nature of reality and what is a human being. Are we purely physical? Are we vehicles or vessels for the soul? We need to know that to understand on a comprehensive level how to treat people. So that's one of the themes of the book. But you're referencing something known as the Flexner Report, which anyone can look up, from 1910. It was sponsored by the Carnegie Foundation and the Rockefellers. And this was basically shifting the approach to medicine from something that was much more holistic to the current system now, the allopathic approach, which to me has two core tenets. One, it's focused on alleviating symptoms rather than getting to the root cause of why the symptoms were there. And secondly, it's reductionistic, meaning it likes to attribute a physical cause to everything. It's not looking at spiritual dimensions. And it loves to do things like there's this one cause, like this little microbe that's getting into your body, and there's one pill that's going to save it. And it's this very linear way of looking at things rather than looking at health as a multifactorial issue that could be very complex. So we moved away starting in 1910 in terms of the way medicine was taught from a holistic approach, from things like homeopathy. That was essentially taken out. So doctors have been trained with this more allopathic approach in the West for over 100 years in this way. So now when we talk to most medical doctors, they're trained in this perspective, and we've been taught to revere them so much. And understandably, it's really hard to get into med school. And then once you're in med school, all the work they have to do to get there, and then residency and fellowship, there's a lot they have to do to get to that point. But my critique would be they've been trained within a system that lacks a broad understanding of the human body. And in many cases, and I should give this caveat, I mentioned it early in my book, that while I'm very critical of the allopathic approach, for certain situations, it's incredibly effective, especially acute injuries or medical emergencies. It's a very good way to get people to where they need to be. The problem is that instead of making that the exception, it's become the rule for how to treat people. It's not really looking at the whole of the human body and the human being as to understand why they're having these symptoms and what even a symptom is. I mean, from an allopathic perspective, a symptom is a bad thing that we want to get rid of because it's uncomfortable. I mean, from my perspective, I understand that. I also think, well, is the symptom telling you something on a spiritual level? Like if there's more intelligence to the reality we inhabit, could a symptom be an indicator that something in one's life is off base? Something emotionally, they're in a job or a relationship that's not working out properly, or they're in a toxic environment. And the symptom is the body's intelligence or the universe's intelligence, and a way of expressing there's a change that needs to happen here. You need to pay attention to it. Versus, okay, this is uncomfortable, let's just get rid of it. Is that really getting to the root cause? And is it even helping a person on a spiritual level if there's a spiritual significance to the symptom? Then they might actually be shutting themselves out by just making a quick fix. Not that there aren't cases where you need to have a quick fix, but I'm talking more about the approach here. And this is a big area of discussion, or philosophically, the way that I'm approaching things in an upside down medicine.
Yeah, and let's poke a little further, because the incentivization structure was driven for petroleum. And when you start to look at why would the Rockefellers, if they wanted to get us hooked on this paradigm and then build the pharmaceutical model in a certain way as symptom management, it's a never-ending moneymaker too, because you can also start to poison the environment with things like glyphosate. And it's like when you start to follow the track record of where the funding goes for the food industry and for the light industry. I don't know how familiar you are with Dr. Jack Kruse, but he really goes deep into the quantum biology stuff and starts to really help us to see that we are light beings. We have been outside for all of human history, outdoor beings, and now we're just jammed inside with these sort of inferior lights, and how much of an effect that has on our health and what it does to our nervous systems and what it does to our own being. It's like putting a plant in the middle of your house and then shining a bunch of flickering blue light on it. It wouldn't last. And so we can't really think that the individual has the problem. It's actually the environment again. And now we have screens that are blue lit. And so I feel like a lot of the stuff that's missing here is the war on light. And that was another thing this guy Peter talked about, is there's light ages and there's dark ages. And when we go into these dark ages, which we're entering or we're almost deep in it, it's because we've forgotten what we are. We are light. If you wanted to talk about soul, it's some form of connection to this electromagnetic spectrum, which we are not separate from. And we're being disconnected from it further and further every day, where kids are in schools, people are working in these buildings. And now they've actually banned incandescent light bulbs, and people don't even know that it's a thing. We're talking about red dye, whatever, and they're talking about food, and we're talking about all these issues, but no one ever talks about the light story. And so I'm really trying to hammer that to my audience and to the people in my field, because I love my family, my friends, and anyone that I'm around is going to hear about breath work. If you can't connect with your breath, you have no control of your nervous system or your consciousness, because you don't even know that you're there. And then I started learning about light, and it's like, okay, what is the most effective thing you can do is get outside and catch the sunrise and spend more time outside and take your sunglasses off. And this whole war on light thing that goes into this pharmaceutical industry is incredible. So I went on a little rant there, but I just wanted to really hammer some story in on the light.
Well, you're speaking to a broader issue. I think what you describe is one symptom of a bigger disease, so to speak, which is the reductionistic view of health. It's much easier to attribute a symptom to a little microbe, to say that thing is getting in your body and somehow messing with your cells, versus something abstract, okay, yeah, I see the light, but what do you mean? being exposed to certain types of light or going out in the sun, that's going to affect these symptoms. People have a hard time with that because it's much more abstract. Or even if you're changing your mindset or breathing differently, shifting your consciousness, what do you mean that those things that are more abstract are going to affect physical symptoms in the body? It's because of the reductionistic view of the nature of reality, that ultimately everything is just a bunch of little billiard balls, physical billiard balls, interacting. One hits the next, hits the next, hits the next. And that's what's causing something physical. And where we're heading in this discussion is sometimes things that are not purely physical in a billiard ball sense that are affecting our health, that are affecting physical things. And one example I like to give very often is Anita Moorjani, who's famous for having had a near-death experience. She was dying of cancer, and she entered a coma state, tumors all over her body. And like many near-death experiencers, she encountered a sense of unconditional love. She met her deceased father. She had many realizations in her own consciousness and resolved conflicts in her consciousness and shifted her view on herself and her life, realized she was too hard on herself. She was resuscitated, and the tumors disappeared. Tumors disappeared because of what? A shift in consciousness, some shift in energy that she had, conflict resolution. These are all very abstract concepts, and yet these physical things on her body were no longer there later. There is an annotated bibliography published by the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which I've been on the board of since 2019. It goes through examples of spontaneous healings. These are cases that do not make sense in conventional medical thinking. But I think for those of us who really want to think about the determinants of health and disease truly, we have to understand these cases because something is happening beyond the physical that is affecting our health, which should lead us, I agree, we should be looking at light, we should be looking at breathing, we should be looking at our own consciousness and thinking about these ideas that are only considered esoteric because of the way that we've been trained in the mainstream. But they really might not be esoteric. They're just fundamental to the nature of reality.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I'm curious about like your thoughts on, is it intentional to keep us sick, down? Like, do you think it's an actual orchestrated effort? That's what it seems to be when like the sunscreen industry and all these paradigms that we're talking about, it's like it's all backed by trillions of dollars and people making a ton of money, even if you wanted to just stay there on the incentive structure, right?
Well, from a strictly business perspective, we don't even have to invoke conspiracy. If you have an industry that's dependent upon people getting sick, and when I say dependent upon, I mean their revenue streams will advance or increase when people are sick. And if you have a lifelong customer, i.e. someone who's sick for his or her whole life, you're generating more revenue. The incentive structure naturally is for people not to fully get rid of their symptoms because you lose customers. Now, what that does on an organizational level, I've never worked inside of a healthcare company or a pharmaceutical company. I don't know the inner workings of it. But the incentives alone are not favorable to the customer because it's not about getting them well long term. It might be about alleviating symptoms or alleviating symptoms just enough as long as you take this pill every day for the rest of your life. That's very problematic. But if we want to take it to the next level, if there is some spiritual war, a war on consciousness, and trying to suppress the empowerment of the individual, it would also make a lot of sense to want to keep people sick because then they're not in their sense of empowerment. They're not going to be as strong to fight back in whatever way that is. They might be more likely to just follow along with authority rather than take personal responsibility because it's easier to do so. If one wanted to corrupt humanity and keep people down, the healthcare system would be a very big part of it. And I mentioned Dannion Brinkley in my book, An End to Upside Down Medicine, who's had multiple near-death experiences and even a life review where he relived his life. He became the people he affected, both positively and negatively. Through their eyes, he felt the results of his actions. So he was a changed man from this, and he's been speaking publicly for years. But he said once, and this might be a direct quote, the war for humanity will be fought in healthcare. That was one of the things he saw. And that didn't land for me fully until I got into this medical topic that my book was published in 2023. Really getting to this dynamic that you brought up of, wait, there's something bigger here. That if you wanted to control humanity, you'd want to keep them away from the things that could be keeping them healthy and also make them ignorant to the things that could be keeping them sick that they don't even realize. That would be a great way to control humanity. So I think Dannion was on to something.
Yeah. And then the attention economy, when you see Tristan Harris and some of the people from The Social Dilemma they're, testifying in Congress and saying, hey, look, this is all orchestrated attention war, and it's a real weapon of mass distraction. And I think that seems to be the thing I keep coming back to if you want to talk about mind control and keeping people trapped. It's the Soma effect that Huxley talked about in Brave New World, where everyone is hooked on a dopamine track through blue lit screens, and it's impossible. I had a friend yesterday tell me how he's having a real hard time getting off of his screen time. And he's like, I just have to admit it. It's like, I'm so addicted to it. And so this is an epidemic that's been orchestrated. And when you look at the light thing, it's tied to it. And it's fascinating how orchestrated and sophisticated this, I guess you could call it a psyop, is to keep everybody completely distracted from their ability to connect with their deeper self and to return to nature, if you will. And now we have this transhuman agenda and the Great Reset. And there seems to be a really quickly speeding up war on the future of humanity, to be honest. This sounds ridiculous to a lot of people that aren't paying attention. But if you're paying attention, you're like, this is actually like a 5 to 10 year plan,
If not longer. The more I look at this, I wonder if this has been going on for many generations.
Oh, I just mean the next 5 to 10 years before
the
it's
next
like
5 to 10.
we're in a real critical tipping point here of we better, get our shit together and organize and come together, or we're going to be in some sort of turnkey totalitarian technocracy.
I think you're right. There are things happening now that we have not seen in at least the mainstream recorded history of coordinated shutdowns around the world, like we saw during the COVID period, where governments around the world were shutting down their citizens and making determinations of what they would call safety based on their quote unquote science. We've never seen such coordination. We've never seen the level of potential manipulation through the media, through social media. I mean, that was pretty unbelievable in the 2020 plus era when messages could be spread in this new way, and also tailored through shadow banning and the censorship we saw on Twitter and Instagram and elsewhere. Anyone who was asking questions about a vaccine then, I mean, this might be forgotten among some who were not as aware at the time, but I think the two of us were posting about those things. You could get censored or completely shadow banned where no one would actually see your content anymore. That was a real thing that we all experienced. So there's an ability now to steer the narrative in a way that we haven't had before with technology. And now with AI, this is something I've been playing around with, and on my social media, especially on Instagram, I post some of the things that AI will either confess to if you present it with facts that it won't tell you otherwise, but also it will admit that it lies and that it will give you answers based on the consensus. So it will give you information, if you just blindly trust it, that is going to steer consciousness in a certain direction. So this social engineering is taking on a totally different character than we've seen in the past. So I agree with you. We seem to be at an inflection point in humanity. And if this notion of mind control seems too difficult for your audience to believe, because it was for me at a certain point, it wasn't until I began to study MKUltra, which is a known declassified government program of mind control, and the sophistication of the technologies that were used decades ago in order to do things to people, to change their mindset or even dissociate their personalities, where they would have a new personality that was created usually through some kind of trauma that the person wasn't even aware of and could be activated with a code word or some stimulus could bring on this new personality they didn't even know about. So when you talk about basically mind control through light and these other forms of technology through social media, and who knows what that's doing to our dopamine system, and that level of sophistication has existed for a very long time. And a lot of the MKUltra documentation is old. So imagine what's happening now with advanced technology and advanced experimentation on mind control. The things that can be done to us on a subtle level are probably beyond our comprehension. And we see this through the media. There's a Project Veritas video I often reference. This was in 2021. And Project Veritas takes these undercover videos of people, and they don't realize they're being recorded. So there was a technical director from CNN back in 2021, height of COVID fear. And he said things like, fear sells. That's what this is about. And he went on to say, a little bit off topic, but very relevant. He said, this COVID thing is going to die down, but climate and fear about climate change, that's got longevity, and that's going to be next. And he was right, because in 2021, they weren't talking about the existential threat of human-caused climate change, whereas now that's much more front and center. So the point here is that through repetition, trauma-based mind control, basically a form of hypnosis through these media channels, and who knows what kind of frequencies they're emitting in the broadcasting and the forms of light we're taking in, like you say, there could be ways of controlling our thinking in a manner that we're not conscious of. And being aware of that is really critical.
Yeah. No, I've dove in pretty deep into MK Ultra. I've even had Tom O'Neill and a few other guests on that have hammered out that subject, and it's fascinating. And I think one of the big points that you're hitting on is that most people don't want to look there. They just want to put their head in the sand and just feel good. And I understand, like, people just want to pay their bills. They need to raise family, kids. They're busy, but at the end of the day, it's up to us. If we truly want freedom, we have to look at the truth. And the shadowy dark stuff, the Epstein stuff, the Diddy stuff, you start looking at these crazy sex rings and you're like, I don't really believe that there's like pedophile rings and billionaires doing all this crazy shit. Like, who wants to look at that? Even I turned my nose to that stuff for a long time. And then it finally was like, all right, I want to know the truth. And I actually would, when I call it prayer, I just sort of listen. And I invite in, like, hey, I'm surrendering and leaving myself open for you to show me the truth. And I'm built with the capacity to handle whatever it is. That's what I've sort of made a commitment to, is like, I want to see it all, and I'm going to have to embody that or bear the burden of reading about all the dark things. And it's not to just fill my consciousness with dark things. It's to know what the behavior shift is and the belief system shift is in myself, so that I can start to redirect the way that I function and move through space-time. And whether people want to look at it or not, I'm going to keep looking at it and I'm going to keep sharing it. You know, I'm not going to just spew it on to people that aren't interested. But let's get into some of the mechanisms that have been used from the MK Ultra programs, which is always built around fear. And I think if you get rid of the spiritual warfare stuff and just go to what we understand about human psychology and Operation Paperclip and what they did with the Jews and the Nazis have done, let's get into what they understand about fear and how they're selling that, because it works. And even the stuff that you're talking about with spiritual warfare and saying there's these negative entities, we have to wonder if that's a psyop. And I'm always curious, like, is that another thing to make it to where you're always worried that now you're not even safe in your own home because the spirits could come and invade your soul? And it's like, I used to lay in the float tank and think, maybe I shouldn't leave my body and go and travel through space because something could take over my body. And then I'm like, well, hold on a minute. If I'm connected to source code energy and we're all connected, I should be able to be protected if I want to seek the nature of truth. And so then you have like a field of protection, if you will, and you can't write that down in a medical book. So I think that we have to remember to get really deeply curious and quiet with ourselves at times to get genuine answers, you know, and people would call that prayer. Like, sincerity and clarity comes from just a little bit of silence and genuine, sincere questions. So anyway, let's talk a little bit about some of these mechanisms.
Well, the word you use, genuine, to me seems critical, because it's almost like an orientation of one's consciousness, the strength and the conviction of the intention that one has. That seems to be a very important thing in terms of achieving the things that we want, or even having the kinds of protection you're describing. That's a theme that comes up. So if people are engineered not to have the conviction in a spiritual reality, for example, where they doubt it or they outright reject it, what does that do for them in this spiritual war, for example? Are they more susceptible to the mind control, more susceptible to things that they wouldn't realize are dark, but actually are, like a wolf in sheep's clothing? We saw this a lot with COVID and the jab. There are many people who had good intentions that would give the jab to family members, or want to protect their family members and say, you can't come to this event because you haven't gotten a jab, so I'm trying to protect my family member. So the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And to me, it's about discernment ultimately. So it's compassion alone, something I talk about in my book, An End to the Upside Down Reset. This is a big theme on the World Economic Forum's Great Reset, because many of these initiatives that we're told about are, number one, they're fear-based. You need to fear this. Fear existential threat, human-caused climate change. Fear this virus that no one has actually ever found in a purified sample. Fear this asteroid, for example, something that's going to knock out humanity, but actually hasn't been validated through direct evidence, but it can kind of be fudged where people will believe it based on inference. That creates a fear state. And then people will act out of what they think is compassionate because they have not discerned properly. So it's like compassion without discernment could actually lead to harm. Blind compassion is dangerous, but compassion with discernment is critical. When we're in the fear state constantly, I think it can tamper with the discernment process. Or let's just say if someone hasn't explored these other realities, they might be more prone to things that they should not necessarily be fearing, but they actually fear it because they haven't gone through the discernment process.
And trusting authority, which is, it leads you to just whatever the science says, is what Fauci would say, or people like that. I'm a fireman for 20 years and I almost lost my job. I was never going to get that jab from day one. And during that time frame, a lot of really cool, good people that I've known for many years were trying to coerce others into getting it. And now it's like there's no talking about it, right? Everybody's like, are we still talking about the pandemic? It's like, we better be, because it was right there. It's like not very far away. And it shows you all of the symptomology and the sophisticated psychological warfare that's possible to orchestrate such an event for so many years, to take our freedoms and to get so many people injected with a very weird experimental jab that also has a lot of really bad things in it. It's a time bomb. And, if I bring that up to people, it causes a lot of emotion because a lot of people got it, more than half the planet. And so it's a nasty subject where you're like, I do have compassion for the people that got it because the PSYOP was so sophisticated. And it's not like they're not good at it. And I could become part of the PSYOP tomorrow for the next thing. It could be the aliens are coming and all of a sudden the government's going to come up and save us or whatever. And I could fall prey to it. And it's always like, don't ever think you got it figured out, because if you do, that means you're fully immersed with that ability to be persuaded by some form of authority. So questioning authority and looking at the shadow stuff is so important. I don't feel like people want to do it. And, that's the real problem. I think that's the stuff Carl Jung would talk about, is if you don't acknowledge the shadow, what happens to it in the self and in the world? And so there's no real grieving now in this attention economy, and how you have discernment when there's like a psyop on where people are able to think. It's like everyone's divided. So I'm not trying to be doom and gloom. I'm trying to actually have more of a long-term healthy outcome for myself and the world. And it requires getting into the shitty stuff.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. This was a big part of my awakening in 2020. When the lockdowns and everything happened, I had written 2 books, An End to Upside Down Thinking and An End to Upside Down Living, which together talk about the scientific reality of these spiritual dimensions, and then also An End to Upside Down Living, how to think about living one's life with this new orientation. And I touched a little bit on the dark stuff in the Living book because I gave warnings about the spiritual awakening journey, where people do encounter challenges, and it's not all roses. It's not just love and light, and there are challenges along the way. But the lockdowns hit, and my wake-up call was seeing people that I respected so highly, and still do today in certain ways, respect them very highly, who I would say have certain spiritual principles down. And I would recommend what they're saying in that regard. But then they were saying, you should be wearing a mask. Lockdowns are good. Definitely get the jab. And Trump's the devil. Democrats are the savior. Like that kind of very polarized way of looking at the world. And I was just stunned, because as someone going into 2020, I was not a political person at all. I didn't even know the difference between Democrats and Republicans, if you can actually believe it. I was so disconnected. I didn't care about politics. And all of a sudden I had to. We all had to care about politics because everything was politicized. A medical intervention was politicized. It was insane what we all know happened. And that led me to look at the nature of deception a bit more, because I was seeing the censorship. I remember seeing an ER doctor early in the spring of 2020, gets on YouTube in a press conference and said, I'm in the ER, and this is not as severe as the media is telling you. That video was then censored, taken off YouTube. Yeah. And we all saw that happen over and over again. Those of us who were looking outside of CNN, basically, or the New York Times, if we looked at alternative sources, we saw immense censorship. So I'm like, wait, on the one hand, you've got these people who are really smart and seem to get it in some ways, but they're missing this big picture. And the deeper I went, to your point earlier, I realized that many of them had not looked into the depths of darkness and of what one might call evil, of really, really dark stuff, of MK Ultra, of torturing people. And I went down the rabbit hole really deep with this whole satanic ritual abuse exploration, which if your audience is interested in that, I mean, I would caution it. I talk about it in my book. an End to Upside Down Contact, where I talk about contact with non-human intelligences, and I go into the dark intelligences that people allege to experience and also the lighter ones. So I talk a little bit about it, but it's the sort of thing where you have to know your own tolerance in reading the accounts of people who have survived this sort of thing, because it's not fun to read about sophisticated torture and the things people went through, especially children. It's so gruesome. But I mention this, and it's important to mention it because of what you said. We need to understand the existence of these things, not to get so wrapped up into it that we're just sitting around crying all day, although that might happen at times. But to me, we need to understand the breadth of the nature of reality. And if this dark stuff exists, we need to know it's there and not ignore it, and not just go all to the love and light. And no, that's just conspiracy theory, which some people might say. So this love and light mentality within the spiritual world is one that I become hypersensitized to. And I do see it more, if politically speaking, or if we're looking at political psychology, it's more on the left. And in my book, An End to the Upside Down Reset, I deconstruct what I call leftism, distinct from liberalism, because a lot of things that are on the left are actually illiberal. A liberal mentality would be people have the right to say what they want to say, versus a leftist mentality is, yes, people should have a right to free speech unless we subjectively deem that speech to be hateful, based on what we call hateful. We could go down the line of this extreme leftism. One of the characteristics, looking at political psychology of the left and of even what we call modern liberals, is an emphasis on compassion and caring for others. It takes up a big part of their moral framework, which is a good thing in some ways, but it can then lead people to be blinded if the compassion is there without discernment. So also, if someone is very compassionate, they might be so attuned to it that they would not want to see the ways in which they themselves are not being compassionate. It would be too painful. So then they'll ignore it. To say, no, I'm not discriminating against those people because I'm a good person. And we see a lot of the I don't like this word, but the word woke, if you know what I mean, where it's like the liberal perspective is what Martin Luther King said. We should not judge people on the basis of superficial qualities like skin color or anything like that. We should judge people on the basis of their character. Whereas what we're seeing now is, well, that's true, except there's this hierarchy of oppression. And if you're part of a group that's been more oppressed, then it's okay to oppress other people who have been less oppressed. Where you end up being actually not compassionate to some people under the guise of being compassionate. So it's like not understanding how deception works, not understanding the dark side and the mechanisms of the wolf in sheep's clothing. Ignoring that could lead a person who is genuinely good to do things that are very harmful. So understanding the dark, I think, is really critical. And I'm so glad you brought it up. It's understanding that it exists so that we can maneuver around it and not fall prey to it. And even within our own psychology, not take the bait. I mean, in my book, An End to Upside Down Living, I talk about where people go wrong in the spiritual path. And the three categories that seem to come up a lot, Mariana Kaplan talks about this: money, sex, and power. These are three things that are not inherently bad if they're used properly, but they are ways in which someone's psyche can be manipulated and taken down a path. So my point is understanding how the dark works so that we will not fall prey to it and make mistakes that, who knows, could be damaging to our families on a physical level, but also to our soul.
Yeah. Yeah, and it goes back to your first principles thinking, which is that if we're consciousness and we don't really know the nature of it, we should start to really get curious about the nature of our own thinking. And the first thing you butt up against is that most of your thinking has been given to you. And when you start to then understand that there's been a lot of the stuff that's been given to you that was engineered in a certain way, it's really important to then look at that. And that's a real sort of uncomfortable feeling. That was my first initial floats, my first initial psilocybin experiences by myself. They were always that really weird, uncomfortable, like, ugh. And you'll sit in it for like a half hour if you're willing to. Otherwise, you could just try to change your state and breathe or move. But it's like, no, hold on a minute. I want to like just sit here and just accept that, everyone I know is going to die, and I'm going to die, and I'm going to get old, and, and then just to go layer after layer and look at all the people that are suffering. And it's like, it's so important to grieve and to look at the real truth, which encompasses all of it. And I think that the real problem here with the spiritual movement, and even with the people that are just straight rationalists, like a Sam Harris, is they get stuck because they're not willing to zoom out and look at their own thinking and question it anymore. There's this like righteousness built into the human condition. And a lot of the spiritual bypassing is like, oh, well, everyone chooses their dharma, and you chose to be here in this body. And it's like, well, hold on a minute. So the pedophile rings, and now there's non-action. Maybe we all did choose it to some degree, but what is the action inside of the suffering? And if you find at the first principle, this is what I've done. I'm sort of into triage and looking at like, all right, let's start with baseline. Like, I'm having some form of experience. Something's happening from nothing. And then if you take a step further, cool, I'm going to be curious and be in awe and humility inside of that space. So I should be in gratitude and appreciation first, because I don't know enough about it to start counting what could go wrong or be in fear. So first you start with like, damn, I'm lucky to be here. That's a vibrational state that keeps you in alignment with the truth, which is that you are not disconnected, but not separate, but connected to all of it of some form. You are not separate from this weird mystery. And that is a frequency that allows you to not have disease. It keeps you healthy. It keeps you from buying into fear, because you're like, well, I don't know enough to worry. But then when you start to see suffering, you have an obligation in self and other. There's like, you can't just feel good and be blissed out and be in all in gratitude and awe and wonder and be in this so-called spiritual vibrational state and then not get boots on the ground and start doing something in your field. If someone's getting sick in front of you or something, or they're out in the heat, or I just feel like there is a form of responsibility that people don't want, which is why they're afraid to look at the truth within self and in the world. It requires a massive amount of movement, and you can't just sit on the hill like a monk your whole life. I mean, some people do, and I do believe that we can change. They're very few and far between that should be doing that predicament. But for the most part, I just feel like we're getting caught in another psyop, which is the MK Ultra 2.75, whatever, which is like get everybody high and feeling good and saying they're taking medicine and healing their trauma. But you're not looking at the environment. You're looking at the individual, and you're actually capturing us in another model of go to your therapist, sit in a chair and get ketamine. It's your trauma. It's your work to do. And it's like, well, hold on. There's another layer to this, that there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on in the culture that's completely sick. Maybe you shouldn't feel good. And maybe it should evoke action and responsibility. And that is the spiritual dynamic that's been stripped of the psychedelic experience. The awe, the mystery, the divine sort of active component to it. Same thing in a float tank. Anything where you're evoking yourself and finding out the nature of reality, it's going to create a lot of pain, which creates a lot of purpose, and opportunity. And I feel like this is not described at all in our culture. It's another Pfizer 2.0 system,
Yeah, you're touching on a very important point of the role of the individual and the role of the collective. And what I found is that there are extremes where someone will just want to focus on the collective and the individual's needs don't matter at all. And if we need to sacrifice one person for the greater good, it's worth it. And we've seen governments weaponize this for a very long time. It's for your safety because we say so. Oh, they're going to be hurt. Well, it's for the greater good. It's okay. That's problematic. But also hyper-individualism is problematic because then it ignores others. And if we are part of something interconnected, then we would want to have others involved too. So what I talk about in my books, especially in Upside Down Liberty, is like this blend of individualism and collectivism, of wanting to work on oneself and doing that work in a controlled setting, however it's done. But it's for the purpose of then being a vessel that can serve the collective better. Because the more we've worked through our own internal stuff, we're better capable and probably magnetized in a way that we can help the collective. So it's like if we do either one in isolation, it can be problematic. Too much individualism is problematic, too much collectivism. And having that blend is really critical. And I also want to touch on your point about what Dr. David Hawkins called radical humility. I think it's critical, not just for the spiritual path, but as we all evaluate what's happening in the world, to keep an open mind that we don't have the full picture. The way Hawkins put it is that all knowledge is provisional. All knowledge is provisional, meaning the things that we know now are based on the data set we have in this moment. But there might be new data that comes in that can make us shift our opinion. So we have a provisional opinion on something. And trying to keep that mindset is really important. And I'm saying this partially to myself. Like the process of writing these books for me is to have to admit, okay, well, I believed this and justified something in an earlier book because of the knowledge I had at the time. But now I would go back and revise that or refine it, even though with the big principles, I agree with all of my books. Like I mentioned, my first book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, there are elements of physics that I don't agree with anymore. I was talking about Albert Einstein's relativity as if it's proven science. At the time, I was taking for granted what I had heard from so many people. And now having looked at my latest book, An End to the Upside Down Cosmos, I don't agree with some of that. And it's an exercise for me, and I'm giving this as hopefully something that your audience can grab onto, of like trying to always keep an open mind about, well, I believe this with a certain degree of probability now, understanding why we believe it. I think that's important too. I believe it because I trust these scientists and I've read some of these papers and it seems to make sense. That could be a justification. Or I believe it because I don't really know and this guy's smart and I'm just going to listen to him, for example. We should know why we believe something, and that might make us more nimble. And I mean, earlier I was critical of the left and liberals, but as you know, in my book, An End Upside Down Liberty, I'm critical of the institution of government itself, all sides of the spectrum, because what happens is I think a lack of intellectual humility of some people saying, I know what's best, and therefore I want to vote for someone to impose my will on the other people who disagree with me because I know what's best. That's really a lack of intellectual humility. That lacks radical humility that Hawkins talks about, because we don't know what's best for other people. How could we actually know what's best for another person? We don't. We can infer, but we don't know what's best. So to infer, to based on an inference, to take this political monopoly structure known as government and the broader principles known as statism, to say this political monopoly then has the right to impose the will of some people on others, and that's a benevolent thing, that's tyranny, even if you call it democracy, of the will of the majority. Well, did the minority vote for that? Did the minority want that to happen to them? No, they didn't. That's not benevolent at all. That's actually tyranny. Murray Rothbard, who's one of my favorite political philosophers, he criticizes this idea and says, well, is murdering some people voluntary suicide on behalf of the people who were murdered because the majority said they should be murdered? Is it voluntary because they were all part of the democracy? No, you can justify horrible things with one group that lacks radical humility, that says they know what's best and they want to impose it on other people.
Yeah, that seems to be what's driving this asymmetrical growth of power and wealth, where the Great Reset, the Klaus Schwab, we can get into all that, and who's at the World Economic Forum and what the great plan seems to be. But it's a lot of this, it's the transhuman agenda. And I started to read about transhumanism, 15 years ago. I remember thinking, before Ray Kurzweil was even the head of Google's AI program and all that, he had a movie out called I forget what it was called, but it was about his life. And I was like, this guy is so afraid of death. Like, his dad died and then it made him obsessed, and he's taken like over 100 pills a day. And a lot of these transhumanists have a disconnect from nature to the degree that like their whole ideology is based on a transformation, a transhuman world. And they sort of are an anti-human group. And if you're anti-human, it's like, ugh. Even the people that say that they're, like Google and all these people that say don't be evil, and Elon Musk is sort of like team human. It's like, is he? We give people so much praise, but it's like, man, these people are driving the ship here, and it's going to require an autonomy and a waking up of individuals to what is actually true and their ability to question reality right now. I feel like questioning authority is first principle, and questioning yourself, that humility piece needs to come in as first base. Is like, okay, hold on a minute. All of my thinking is just BS. Like Robert Anton Wilson said, it's bullshit. Belief systems are just BS. And now it's time to like strip them back and look at what's left. And it's like, oh, there's not much left. That's really uncomfortable for people because it feels good to have the answer. And it's like, that's what gets people through the day because of our little weird fear of death and the unknown. But I think it's time to just confront reality. And people like my mother are never going to do that. And I love her for that. So it's like, at the same time, I almost understand it. I would never expect her to listen to this particular podcast and be like, oh yeah, I'm in on that. Like, keep going, Ryan. I'm proud of you for thinking that way. It's like, no, she just doesn't even get to have the conversation. And so she's someone in my closest field where I'm like, that's not even a conversation that's available, because it makes her feel good, which allows her to be a good mom to my niece and to all the people that she impacts. So I actually don't know exactly what the solution is, other than on the individual level, which turns into a collective solution, which is to come alive and to question yourself and to question authority as first baseline, and maybe orient towards a little bit of love and gratitude. That's a good starting point, because I really don't know what the solutions are. What are you coming up with as solutions at this point?
To me, the solution at the core is a shift in consciousness, which starts with the individual's consciousness shifting to a lot of the principles that you were just describing. And then I think as we shift our own individual consciousness, we then take on our authentic self and are able to share our authentic gifts with the world, which helps the collective. But I agree with you strongly that, number one, not everyone's ready for different levels of this awakening. And I can say this for myself. There's certain things I've written about more recently that I probably wasn't ready for in 2016. So it helps me understand where people are on their stage of the journey. I mean, if you talk to me pre-2016, I wasn't ready for a spiritual worldview. And that helps me sometimes when I get frustrated and see a person that I really respect and think this person's very intelligent and yet will not be willing to have this conversation. We don't even know on a soul level, maybe they're not meant to have some of these awakenings because they need lessons. And if they had this knowledge, they wouldn't be able to have those lessons. So for me, it's made my approach hopefully not as combative as it could be, where I love to have these conversations and share them publicly and write books, but it's almost a passive and active way of helping because the information is now available for those who want to have it, but it's not forced on them. So that's point one that I think is important. And that's been part of my philosophy of like, when I come across someone who's not open, like, okay, that's where they are. There's no point even in trying to push them. But if I talk to someone who has a little bit of an opening, then I'm willing to share more and open the conversation. Otherwise, I found that it's not worth it because many people in that place who haven't come to these understandings or even questionings, they're not necessarily interested in the truth. They're interested in protecting their worldview. And if they're not interested in the truth, you can't have an open intellectual conversation because they'll completely shut down. And that leads to another point that you were getting at of like, this constant openness. You're reminding me of Byron Katie's work, where the question that you ask yourself, she calls it personal inquiry. And anyone can look this up online where you can do this with your own individual beliefs, like a step-by-step process of just asking a few questions. But the first question is, you take a belief that's disturbing to you and you say, is it true? And then the second question is, can I know with certainty that that belief is true? And to me, the answer, unless the statement is one thing, is always going to be, I don't know with certainty. To me, there's only one thing we know with certainty, which is that at this moment, it feels like I'm having a conscious experience. The past to me is an inference because it's a memory I have that is occurring in the present moment. It might be a very compelling inference, but I can't directly prove it. If I look at a picture from the past or the alleged past or a movie from the alleged past, I'm still observing it in the present moment. And if I think about the future, that's occurring in the present moment, for example. And it feels like I'm conscious right now. Everything else is some degree of inference. Some are more stretches than others. Therefore, I don't know with certainty so many things. And where I found this in myself, but the public at large, we often run into problems of jumping to models of reality based on a few data points. There's a logical fallacy. It's called affirming the consequent. I see this everywhere. Science, medicine, consciousness, politics, economics. If X, then Y, Y, therefore X. More simply put, if it rains, the grass outside will be wet. I observe wet grass, therefore it rained. Why is that a problem? Because wet grass can be caused by a million things other than rain. Dew, sprinkler systems, many other things. You could have wetness on grass. It doesn't have to be rain. But it's true that the model that it rained, that would explain wet grass. So if we were to generalize this, it's possible to have a model that can accurately explain observations in reality while still being an incorrect model. So what happens is we'll come up with a model that fits the few data points we have and say, okay, that explains reality very well because we've explained these few data points. We see wet grass. Well, rain explains wet grass, so it rained. We're good. And what happens is we tend to not consider the other possibilities that could exist. And maybe some of those possibilities of why there's wet grass, it could have to do with something we don't understand in science that caused the wet grass. Some element of biology or metaphysics that in that instance caused wet grass. So to me, it's super important not to jump to causal models of reality. We see this all the time. Like, I'll just pause there. But that's part of this humility process of being aware of affirming the consequent. Just because we can explain reality adequately with a certain model doesn't mean the model's correct. We don't always know the causation.
Yeah. It's making me think about the idea that if you were to completely get rid of civilization, all people right now, and they had to restart over with new language, new technology. There was a book, I think, The Bicameral Mind. It was something along the lines of that. But it has this idea of like when consciousness emerges and it starts to build these linguistic models that you're talking about, the technology and the physics and the math and everything starts to build its own groove, if you will, and everything that is built inside of our reality, all of our tech right now, if you look at Edison versus Tesla, just the way that we were thinking about approaching energy changes the way that we then produce and live inside of our culture. So it's almost like all of our scientific and physics and all of our models are built off of these ideas that you're talking about. But if you were to think about it from different vantage points as you're trying to do, it would give us far more ability to access, say, the sun's energy and use it in different ways where we did have free energy. And then everybody doesn't have to be in this asymmetrical form of power and, scarcity and survival mode and trying to pay their rent. Like there is abundance underneath this. And that's why it's so important to get some of these models correct, because if it's inside of a scientific system with the right physicists and the right people collectively working towards technologies that's been built on these principles that you're talking about, and with an orientation for para el bien de todo, the good of all, and like a reciprocity, even the foundations of our logic and the way that we relate to the world, instead of it just being about consumerism and status and trying to get more, it's about no, give your goods to the other and make sure that the tide is raising for everyone. So I think that it's just like, if we don't get our thinking right as individuals and as a collective, we'll never get our technology right to then allow it to be a symbiotic, healthy relationship to allow us to have a really beautiful, high vibrational, loving society.
I agree with you. I mean, well said. It starts with the mind. It goes back to my earlier answer. A shift in consciousness is where all of these things begin.
Yeah. What are some of the biggest behavior and belief system shifts you've had over writing these 7 books? Like, I'm sure it's made you change the way that you live, and like your friend groups and what you're willing to do with your time. Like, you have to say no to the boring cocktail party, and you probably don't hang out at sports bars anymore. Because I know that was my hard flip, was like, I went from being completely unconscious and like partaking in all this weird shit for the first 25 years to like now I can sit home and read 3 books and maybe have like 3 really good friends in my local environment that I can have really deep conversations with. But I'm just curious how your life has changed since all this.
It's shifted dramatically. I mean, I left my job, that was big because that took up a lot of my day. Even when I was interested in these more existential topics, I was taking my time outside the office to focus on that. And then I would go to work and get into a client setting. So cutting that out was huge. That was end of 2019, early 2020. But I have noticed that my friend circles and interactions have shifted dramatically. The types of conversations I'm having, I find that people enter my sphere who are largely interested in this stuff. Even if I'm in a setting that might be more mainstream, I like happen to find the one person that wants to talk about something. And I'm finding fewer scenarios that I would now consider to be more mundane. They have seemed to leave my life. And it continues to shift because my own paradigms are shifting, both in terms of my internal beliefs about my own life and my own subconscious thoughts and things like that. And then also the paradigms that I'm speaking about more publicly. So my circles have shifted, and my sense of what I prioritize in life, that's shifted dramatically. The way I want to spend my time. I'm much less tolerant of spending time on things that I do not feel are worthwhile. And I'm more likely now just to cut them out because my body will feel pulled down by it almost. Like I'm less tolerant. I actually can't do it unless it's part of my alignment.
Yeah, it's amazing how energy really works. Like if you're working on something that you're passionate about, you have infinite energy almost. And if you're around people that inspire you or that you have a genuine, authentic, sincere connection with, it's like it gives energy, right? And if you're doing things or saying yes to things that don't feel good, it's a complete pull. And I feel like we can tap into an infinite energy source when we're in alignment with what it is that we actually truly feel called to do or truly curious about. I'm all about inspiring curiosity. I think it's one of those things that's been like smushed out of us. When you start reading about the weapons of mass instruction and all those books about the education system, and that history is so important because children, they're naturally little curious beings that want to move around and be free, and they're so healthy. And then they enter the institutions, and not to say it's all bad, but most of it is just like you're stuck inside. You're not allowed to move. You're supposed to go through this model, the cookie cutter model. And I think curiosity is probably the life force energy of learning about even the shadow, the light, everything. So I feel like that is number one, is to like light that fire in you, whatever you're curious about for people. But yeah,
Well,
anyway.
It's really not part of the training, at least the way I experienced it growing up, societally and educationally. It's more about achieving the things that we're told we need to achieve versus doing the things that light us up. Because if we do something that lights us up, but it's not part of the societal track, then it can be frowned upon. So what you're describing, I totally agree with. It's like starting with a clean slate almost. And for each individual, get to the core of what is it that really lights you up, that you want to be moving towards, and putting the energy toward that. And what I found is that I spent a lot of my life not even knowing what lit me up because I was so focused on achievements, and then getting rid of and then pushing through, doing things that I probably didn't want to do. And it was causing sickness and mental distress, but just trying to push through, then getting to a point of saying, okay, I need to get those layers out of my life, and then making conscious decisions to say that this does not work for me anymore. I'm going to have to say no to it or leave this. And that was a new exercise for me, leaving room then for the things that do light me up more.
That's beautiful. Is there a book that you're thinking about starting to want to write now, or is there ideas coming in hard? No, you're sort of like,
No.
I wrote my 7 books right now. I'm waiting. You're waiting for the next push, huh?
Yeah, to me, the books, I feel like they're written through me rather than by me. I mean, before I actually sit down to write, get on Microsoft Word, I call to all of the benevolent energies that are out there and basically say, I'm going to be a vehicle or vessel for this book to serve the greatest good of all. So I'm here not to be the real author, but to be just the one who happens to be typing this out. Like, that's the energy I put forth with it. And that means that I can't force a creative project. It's going to have to come to me, that creative insight or the spark. And that's why I tell people that I might never write another book again. I've said this many times before and then have written books, but right now there's nothing calling me to the level that would be needed to want to write a full book about something and go through that process. I don't have a new creative project.
Yeah, it's like it's writing itself through you. That's pretty cool. There was one person I wanted to ask you. You know who Eric Weinstein is?
Yes.
When you listen to him speak, I listened to Terrence Howard on Joe Rogan. I'm sure you did. And he was going off into some of these really a lot of what he said I was loving. And then some of it I was like, man, I really don't know enough to question him. And then when he sat down with Eric, I thought it was interesting. I sort of felt like he was picking on him and he was it was like a power move. But what would you think about that dynamic? And what would you think about him sitting down with you? Like, what would he say about your most recent book, if you could imagine?
Yeah, and Into the Upside Down Cosmos, speaking with Eric Weinstein. I don't know him personally, so anything I say is based on what I've seen from him in interviews.
Yeah.
I think he's very smart intellectually and certainly comes from a more mainstream background. But among those who are more mainstream, he's at least open to having these conversations. So I respect him for that, because some people won't even have the conversation.
Exactly.
And he's been more open to things like UFOs and just stuff that's outside the mainstream, and yet he holds that mainstream perspective. So I think there's a lot of value in what he does because he straddles the line a bit more than others. I don't know what he would say, because my guess is he's probably not familiar with a lot of the principles and the approach that I'm taking. One of the reasons I wrote the book, An End to the Upside Down Cosmos, which for your audience's benefit, it challenges things like, did the Big Bang happen, right? Does Earth revolve around the sun? Does Earth move? What is the actual shape of Earth? Is Earth an oblate spheroid shape with a radius value of roughly 4,000 miles at the equator? Have these things actually been validated? Or are they guesses where we're seeing wet grass and we're like, oh, well, rain would explain it and therefore it's wet? I mean, the problem is we don't have direct evidence for any of these things. There's no video footage of a Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago. We barely know what happened a year ago or 10 years ago or 100 years ago. There's a lot of inference there. We've never seen Earth's motion. We've never seen Earth free falling around the sun at over 66,000 miles per hour. We've never seen a full sphere do a full rotation on a tilted axis. There's no video footage of continuous 24-hour footage of Earth doing that, where you have buildings standing upright on the top and hanging sideways on the side simultaneously while hanging upside down on the bottom. We don't have any of that stuff. So a lot of the beliefs with mainstream cosmology are based on these sets of inferences. And my guess is he probably has not evaluated those things. And I wouldn't expect him on the fly to just flip. I mean, it took me a long time and hours of research to say, okay, when we bring all these things together and realize that Albert Einstein's relativity was based on interpretations of of scientific studies in the late 1800s, like Airy's failure and the Michelson-Morley experiment, which you could actually interpret differently. If you didn't presuppose that Earth moves, if you said, wait, Earth is stationary, then those experiments become interpreted differently. You can bring in the ether, which those studies allegedly eliminated, and the ether is known as the fifth element in ancient cultures, but actually might be a very important part of physics and science. But if the ether is back in the picture, then we have to rethink so many of the theories that have been taken for granted, like Einstein's relativity and a lot more. So it's the cosmology topic is very challenging for people because it's multi-layered. You have to rethink the basics of physics. You have to rethink geology even, and like the core of Earth on the sphere model is allegedly 4,000 miles down. And there's all these theories about you have a molten core and there's an outer core. And because it's spinning in a certain way due to the geodynamo effect, Earth's magnetic field is generated. And based on the belief in Earth's magnetic field, there's some strange things, like compasses don't work properly without adjustment, known as magnetic declination. And if you go to Antarctica, sometimes you have to adjust your compass on the order of, it's like off by 170 plus degrees. And then another location, it's off by much less. So you have to have these manual adjustments, but it's only because we believe that the magnetic field comes from Earth's core, but we've never been to Earth's core, or the outer core in particular. So there are these beliefs of, well, Earth's inner core is too hot to generate a magnetic field, but the outer core is not quite as hot. And there's this geodynamo effect that causes the magnetic field, but no one's ever validated the geodynamo effect. And because of that, we end up with these beliefs. And we've only been able to dig down, by the way, under 8 miles. We haven't dug down 4,000 miles where the core is supposed to be. And that's just one element of the globe model, which is part of the cosmology, really, because the globe Earth model implies that Earth has a certain mass based on its radius value, and based on theories of gravity and relativity, mass is a very important thing, because if Earth had a different mass, then we'd have to rethink everything else in all the universe, because the mass of Earth is going to have a gravitational pull through relativity on everything else. So my point here in just giving these anecdotes is you have to unravel so much to get to the cosmology questions that it's difficult to do in one conversation. So my guess is he would need to spend a lot of time before having that conversation.
Yeah, even when I was listening to you on the way forward and a couple other ones, it's like, man, this is a deep series that you'd need to go into. But even your subject on the ether and how a lot of the newer scientists are saying that we don't really know what the dark energy is and gravity is, and we don't know what the electromagnetic field is. And biophysicists are now going, yeah, well, all of it's connected. And we're, so there's so many questions when it comes to the nature of consciousness and the nature of the universe, and which is really cool because at the end of the day, like you said, all of it is inside of our own images in our head.
Yeah.
And so when you start to look at MK Ultra and how they're infused into NASA and how that whole paperclip thing unfolded, that's really fascinating, because then you're like, are we being given certain imagery and certain models for a certain reason to keep us thinking that we're only allowed, because then you're somewhat trapped inside of a model. All of us have this weird relationship now to the cosmos that's limited, because when you get in a float tank or have a psychedelic, you start to discover the akashic fields, which I didn't know the word for that. Or you could call it the morphic resonance, the morphic fields. We don't know what to call it, but we don't know what it is. And it's like we have access to like this giant, weird, resonant memory thing. It's like the collective memory. And like, how are we accessing that if we're all told that we're just, like you said, balls on a table bumping into each other? So I think it's a really big deal to question these things. And it doesn't mean that you're saying that no science is real, but it's to help people get back to the humility factor and go, you know what? The universe is quite mystical and magical, and there's a lot of unknowns. And there's a lot of unknowns about the nature of my thinking. So that makes it more interesting. I think it makes life far more interesting and inspiring when you surrender all the bullshit and get back to the curiosity and the wonder and the awe again. And then you can also work and live inside of this world that's been built with physics. It's like, I'm not afraid to get on an airplane. And I do trust that we're actually talking to each other through a screen and that there's actual real scientific evidence that works. It's founded on physics and there's trust there. But I think we better start questioning our models, because all it is a model, like you're saying.
Right. There are many things that can work, but we don't understand the mechanism as to why it works. It's going back to the rain and wet grass analogy again. This technology works, and if this physics were true, the technology would work that way. And because we see that this works, therefore the physics is true. No, all that we see is that this technology works. We don't necessarily understand exactly why. The mechanism, the cause of the observation is distinct from the thing that we observe. That's a very important thing, because so much of cosmology and medicine and beyond, it's based on these leaps coming to a model to explain why something happened that might not necessarily be true. And to go back to the Eric Weinstein discussion, where I would start the discussion with him, let's say he hadn't evaluated anything, it's where I start my book and Into the Upside Down Cosmos, is that if we can start on common ground. Just like with consciousness, there's a hard problem. We don't understand how consciousness could pop out of a brain. No one has ever seen consciousness pop out of a brain. Okay, there are questions. With physics, we got big questions. Einstein's relativity and quantum mechanics, those are supposed to be the two leading theories that are established. But when you bring them together, metaphorically speaking, the equations blow up. They're incompatible. Einstein supposedly works at the big galactic scales, quantum's the small stuff. They work well individually, collectively, together they don't work. Michio Kaku, a mainstream physicist, he said that we are off in science and cosmology by a factor of 10 to the 120th power. 1 with 120 zeros after it. So without even having a big discussion, we know physics is broken. We don't have anything that can unify the leading theories. And on top of that, 96% of the universe is made of dark matter and dark energy. 4% is what we know. So how could we possibly have any view of what's going on if you had to plug in 96%? And the story with dark matter, which is how I start my book, and I think if people really try to grok the implications of this, of what I'm about to say. In 1933, Fritz Zwicky, an astronomer, observed the Coma cluster of galaxies. And he saw basically that things were not moving in a way that would be predicted by Einstein's relativity, which is the revised version of Newton's gravity. This is big stuff. There was missing mass because this relativity and gravity are based on mass. There was missing mass on the order of 99%. So to me, there were two options. Option one, we need to rethink gravity and all of Einstein. Option two, well, Einstein's obviously right because it's Einstein. So there must be missing mass that we just don't understand. So we're going to call it dark matter. We're going to plug in dark matter, and dark matter must be there because Einstein's obviously right. That's basically what they did. It was a post hoc rationalization. They plugged in dark matter, and now scientists have been trying to understand it. We don't understand what it is. And now we have some physicists, including Pavel Krupa, who has his own Wikipedia page, a mainstream professor at the University of Bonn in Germany, saying, we're looking at the predictions you would expect to be true based on dark matter. They're not there. We have falsified dark matter with more than 5 sigma confidence, meaning 99.999+% confidence. Dark matter has been falsified. So think about the ripple effect, the house of cards. Wait, you needed dark matter in order for Einstein to work? And you need Einstein, which we haven't gotten into because there are problems with Newton's gravity. For example, he's unable to predict Mercury's motion around in the sun and the sky. That's kind of a big deal. You don't have a comprehensive theory if you can't predict that. And that's the idea that mass is attracting mass, and gravity, this notion of gravity, that an apple falls to the ground because of these reasons, not because of some other reason we don't understand. Well, wait, you needed dark matter in order for those gravitational ideas to be right. And you kind of need gravity to work if you want oceans to stick onto a ball rather than fall off, i.e. the way the globe model works, in addition to the way that all of the cosmic motions are supposed to work because of this notion of gravity. And you needed dark matter in order for all that to work. And dark matter has been falsified. Wait, now everything has to be reconsidered. To me, that's a very good starting place. 96% of the universe is dark matter and dark energy, and that has to be true in order for the quote-unquote laws of physics to work. And now we falsified dark matter. And forgetting all that, there's no unified theory of physics that can reconcile gravity or Einstein's relativity and quantum mechanics. We're off by a major factor. The foundations of physics do not work. And therefore, someone cannot say to me, well, Mark, don't question cosmology because we can make so many predictions and we understand things so well. To me, what they're saying is, the unspoken part is, grant me these miracles and then I can explain everything so well. They're forgetting the grant me these miracles part.
Yep. It's like that Terence McKenna quote. He's like, give me one free miracle and we'll explain the rest with the Big Bang Theory. It's so silly. Yep. The idea that we could conceive to imagine that we could describe how the universe got here and where it started is such a laughable thing. It's even more laughable than just fundamentalist religious ideology where you get down to like, this is a dude in the sky in 7 days, and you go down to like really believing it fundamentally, literally true. I would take that narrative over the Big Bang Theory. But it's funny how we latch onto these stories, and then it limits our ability to know what our actual technology from inside of our consciousness actually is, like telepathy, which you're studying and interviewing and finding all these incredible case studies that we've probably just forgotten our lost technology from our consciousness. Telepathy is fully real. And it's like, how do we learn and train that? And there's a million other things that are like that. But I know you got to get going, and I don't want to keep holding you up. So maybe we'll do a round 2 another day if you're ever interested.
I would be happy
much
to.
unpack.
Yeah,
Cool.
yeah. I really want to thank you, Ryan, for having this conversation and for going into all these depths. I'd be happy to continue the conversation anytime you'd like. And if your audience is interested in my work, my website is markgober.com, markgober.com. All 7 books are on Amazon in hard copy, Kindle, and Audible formats. I narrate the audibles. And to your question of consciousness, not just the book An End to Upside Down Thinking, but also my podcast series. It's 8 episodes. Where is my mind? And it goes into all this stuff. It goes into Dr. Diane Powell's work on autistic savants and things like that and their telepathic abilities, but also near-death experiences and more. Where is my mind?
Yeah, I highly recommend it. Dive deep on this. And if you were going to die today, is there anything you'd want to share with the world?
Always ask questions.
I love that. Cool, brother. Appreciate you, Mark.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the episode. Be sure to subscribe to the show on Spotify, YouTube, and iTunes, and rate the show. I hope you enjoyed the episode.
What we call reality is in fact nothing more than a culturally sanctioned and linguistically reinforced hallucination.